Yeah, good day. My name's Justin Tutty.
Again, Mr. Tutty, if you can just either move the microphone a bit closer, just excellent, thank you.
Okay. This is the third time we've met. Thanks again for all your work. I don't endorse your report. I note in particular the chapter addressing the heavy carbon burden of this industry, which I identified originally as an outright disqualification. Does not seem to have benefited much from public participation. I find it deficient and sloppy. But rather than going over a second time my objections, I'm going to take on the distasteful task of looking at your recommendations and trying to tune them up a bit. I can see a lot of very useful recommendations if this vast area is to go ahead. And I can see a number of others which could be a bit better with a little bit.
Well, that's what we're really keen to hear about is where the improvements can be made or where there are things that you disagree with.
I do refer you to our previous conversations, and I do commend the previous two witnesses. A couple of really obvious but missing recommendations. I note that the inquiry hasn't recommended that the NT government institute carbon emission reduction targets. It's a disgrace that the NT has abolished their carbon targets. Most other jurisdictions have targets. It really, sorry, I'm losing it. The other obvious recommendation that's missing is regarding offsets. There's some discussion about carbon offsets, but there's no recommendations. It alludes to the, NGR safeguard mechanism. We're told it's likely that any new unconventional shale gas production facilities will be covered by the safeguard mechanism. Offsets should be a certainty, not just a likelihood. Given uncertainty about field-wide fugitive emissions, noting recommendations for monitoring, the NGR appears inadequate because it allows producers to nominate a standard bottom-up factor. It really allows them to choose the weakest estimate for their pollution to offset, and we know we can do better. We're also told that the mechanism uses financial incentives to encourage companies to find their own least cost and effective emission reductions approaches. I don't think that should be our objective. We should consider the NT's good experience of multiple benefit offset activities, such as habitat management and bushfire abatement. We should pursue, for example, specific offset commitments that represent a net carbon saving, but also empower traditional owners to work on country and provide compounded environmental benefits like habitat protection. So I call upon the inquiry to make a clear, ambitious recommendation that ties generous, multi-benefit offset actions to top-down measurements of the industry's pollution. If there was just one piecewise improvement that I'd like to see to your set of recommendations, that would be diligent, explicit recognition of the significance of pre-production impacts, and I was pleased to hear you've already heard a bit on that today. I think it was the fella from AFAN describing it quite well. Many good recommendations are made with a qualifier along the lines of by or before production. And there's a few good recommendations that don't specify any sequence, where we should specify before any further activities, including exploration and including on existing leases. Onshore gas has particularly higher risk and impact from pre-production activities than other resource exploitation activities do. This is one of the reasons the existing regime for resources is inadequate for addressing the peculiar hazards and harms that this new industrial practice presents. It's essential that implementation of baseline monitoring and a new management framework are achieved before any further activity, rather than merely before production. I mean, in some places, to some extent, it's already too late because there's already been activity, but let's draw a line. Just quickly, I know 5.6 doesn't specify. Recommendation 7.1 about the Water Act says before production. Recommendation 7.3 doesn't specify about guidelines for risk assessment. The SREBA, it's a bit sloppy. We have recommendation 7.4, which first identifies the SREBA says before any production licenses are granted in the BLO. Then 8.1 says SREBA must inform any decision to release new land for exploration, and then 15.1 says SREBA be undertaken prior to production licence. So I think that all needs to be tidied up. Regarding carbon, 9.2, 9.3 both say before production, and that's not good enough. 11.8 about cultural impacts, that talks about production to 14.16. 1432. Those are the ones I found. I think you should audit all your recommendations with that perspective. I see good recommendations around water, which is quite appropriate, noting that we have not been able to make a definitive assessment of the risk of unsustainable groundwater use, unacceptable contamination of groundwaters, or unacceptable impacts on the aquatic ecosystems. Let's look at 5.4. Regarding well integrity, that's something I don't know much about, but I think you've heard a bit about today, maybe. It references a well area plan containing well area performance standards with specific reference to protection measures for beneficial use aquifers. I draw your attention to the lax state of water planning in this jurisdiction. Even just the declaration of control districts moves very slowly. So the presence of defined beneficial uses is no real measure of relative value of a resource. We should not look to the current poor regime as any indicator of priority. Rather, we should apply the highest standard to protection of all water resources. Recommendation 5.6 regarding wastewater, I just thought could be a bit more prescriptive. Develop a wastewater management framework. That made me think of the Waste Management Pollution Control Act, which is a tick and flick licensing scheme, which is usually applied as a formality post-approval. You fill in your form and pay a fee and get your licence. That kind of fits this very loose recommendation. I urge you to define at least some fundamental features of a robust management framework. That the absence of any treatment and disposal features be addressed as a matter of priority. What does that mean, addressed priority? If the inquiry believes that the treatment and disposal facilities are a necessity, then let's be specific and make that a prerequisite, again, ahead of any future works, not just a priority. Recommendation 7.1 to reform the Water Act requiring fee-based extraction licences. Again, water planning in the NT is quite immature. This could have a selling licence to extract in aquifers without a plan, or controls without limits. So 7.6 is important. I find there's some good solid recommendations that are welcome. I understand to be as requiring that there be allocation plans covering the area targeted by the industry immediately. I'm sure that existing water users in the region will welcome an opportunity to engage in a deliberative process to determine shared objectives for conservation of natural and cultural values associated with their resources. Again, this important and welcome recommendation must be specified as a prerequisite for any further activity. This is just as relevant for exploration as it is for exploitation. And quality is just as important as limits. 7.2. Request amend the EPBC Act to apply the water trigger. Gee, that sounds good. I'm going to proceed on the assumption that we want a better outcome than having our request duly noted. Obviously what this would mean would be triggering federal oversight of assessment. If the inquiry truly believes that federal oversight of assessment is required, I certainly do, let's not make this a requested amendment. Let's be careful to recommend what we really want. I've got a bunch of queries, like it's a bit open-ended. How's this compatible with the recommendations about regulatory reforms. Do we envision an MOU or a new bilateral agreement? Does this inquiry believe that the arrangements in other jurisdictions, I think it's the Independent Expert Scientific Committee, has the same expertise that we need in the NT. So yeah, that one, like, it sounds good, but it needs a bit of work. Then to your welcome recommendations, 12.16, establish or enhance an independent authoritative body. Direct as an independent regulator. And 14.3.32, let the government develop and implement the reforms, the reform options you've proposed. Strongly support this direction. Our problems are twofold. The regulator has neither inclination nor capacity to actively monitor and enforce environmental requirements of authorisation. First of all, capacity for monitoring. Well, for example, a Ranger uranium mine, they do irregular, routine check sampling of groundwater. As things have changed on site recently with major rehabilitation works, we've started to wonder about shallow water movement and said maybe NT government should be cross-checking that data as well. They've come back and said, well, we have to drop something if we want to pick something up. Lost my place. Inclination. I think maybe this panel's heard this recent scandalous news out of MacArthur River where large volume of waste was placed somewhere on site. They were totally not authorised to put it, and it was all dealt with verbally, demonstrating a real disinclination to act upon breaches of authorisation. It's all very well for the EPA to reply that they're disinclined to play this independent role which you've identified. That doesn't mean that NT government alone has capacity for it. I think we need to do a bit more work to scope out the required increased capacity. From your options, option 1 looks good to me, but there's, currently there's a bold environmental law reform agenda underway which we wouldn't want to interfere with, and so you might want to think about how your recommendations might interface with that. Finally, I've got 14.2.6. Government consider developing and implementing a tiered regulatory model. I strongly oppose that.
Sorry, can you just lift your voice, please, Mr. Tutty? Again, you're hard to. You've got a lovely soft voice, and I'm, for one, at least partially hard of hearing.
I'm strongly opposed to your recommendation 14.26.
Thank you.
Not philosophically, I get it. And it might be all right in a well-defined and experienced problem domain, but we're only beginning to think about how we might regulate this new industrial threat, and it's way too soon to be looking for opportunities for efficiently allocating regulatory resource. That's all I've got for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have one question in relation to 14.26. Why do you strongly oppose it? It's not quite clear to me. The way, and I'll probably overly generalize my summarization, so forgive me in advance, but the way the South Australian model works is effectively as a sliding scale. If you're a good operator, you slide down the scale in terms of oversight. If you are a bad operator, you slide up the scale in terms of oversight, and that has implications for reporting fees and so on. That has proved to be quite effective in South Australia in terms of encouraging compliance. Very effective. Everybody starts off, I should say, with the assumption that they are a bad operator and starts off with the high levels of compliance.
I would expect that it would encourage gamification. Let's think about it in 10 years. We don't have the experience to be able to decide that someone's a good operator and that, and that some people need less scrutiny.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Professor Hart.
I just had a point of clarification on recommendation 7.2. It's the one to do with the EPBC Act. You, I think, took offence at our use of the word request. I should remind you that this inquiry is reporting to the NT government. That's a Commonwealth Act. There's nothing more than requesting that the NT could do.
I think that if you're after an outcome, let's specify what that outcome is.
We have.
But perhaps the first act. Well, if all you're after is a request, then that has no material effect.
No,
I would suggest that what we might be after would be federal oversight, because if the request was granted, that would be what we get. And so I encourage you to beef up that recommendation to be more substantial and more directive towards that outcome.
Okay, look, it might be a matter of semantics, but I think in fact we're all on the same page in respect of what we want the objective to be, which is, yes, that the water trigger apply to shale as well as coal seam gas, and we've certainly written to the minister suggesting that consideration ought to be given to that.
So let's specify whether that would engage the IESC. Let's specify the mechanism by which that would happen.
Understood. I understand that submission. Any further questions? Yes, Dr. Beck.
Thank you for your comments and observations, and acknowledge that you have a long-standing and passionate concern for greenhouse gas emissions and the associated temperature warming associated with that global warming. You also made some suggestions as to how this could be some policy initiatives. I think one was the recommending that the NT government introduce a carbon reduction targets, and you also mentioned potential carbon offsets and the program and some of the problems and how it might be improved. Just to firstly thank you for your ongoing passion, but also to note that in terms of the terms of reference that the panel is operating under, we're constrained to the issue of shale gas operations and are not in a position to make recommendations that go beyond that. But your observations are noted.
Okay, so I imagine that would apply to a recommendation for targets, but not offsets. Am I following you?
Sorry, what I'm saying is that both those propositions that you're putting are beyond the scope of this inquiry.
Really, you do not feel empowered to recommend the nature of carbon offsets for this industry? Wow.
No, we'll look again at the terms of reference, but that's my reading of it. But I think the points you've raised are very good ones, and we'll yes, look again at the terms of reference, because I do think they're good points. Any further questions? All right, thank you very much again, Mr. Tutty, for a thoughtful and considered presentation. Certainly the panel appreciates your engagement with it.